Welcome to the Relationship Revolutions podcast with Alan Watts, the love engineer. The world needs more healthy, loving and lasting relationships, yet school does not teach how to attract, build and keep them.
Hello, Charlie McCready. We are
Hello,
live
Alan.
with the Relationship Revolutions podcast. So we're going to be talking about all things to do with parental alienation and all that kind of thing, which a lot of people have never heard of. So we're going to cover what that actually is. But first off, would you be willing to firstly share with us even, who are you, where are you, and what are you?
So my name is Charlie McCready. I'm a parental alienation life coach. I'm just outside of London in a place called Sevenoaks here in the UK. And I'm not sure if I've answered all of your questions or if I missed one within that.
No, I think you've covered most of it. So, parental alienation life coach. That sounds a little bit different, bizarre. Not as common as your average kind of accountant or all the normal people you meet in business networking things, and certainly not a career opportunity when you leave school. So what is a parental alienation life coach? How do you become one?
That's two very good questions. Is it helpful if I just give a moment on what is parental alienation for the benefit of those who don't actually understand that term as well? So in essence, parental alienation is where one parent is seeking to stop the other parent from having, or they're trying to damage the relationship with what we call the targeted parent. And they do this by manipulating and coercing a child, typically giving them a false sense of narrative, negative understanding of the other parent. And they will say, they will basically do things that damages your relationship with your child. Now, this, in most instances, the targeted parent has done nothing wrong. And alienation often comes about at a point of separation or a divorce. Sometimes it comes about at the point of court hearings. But it is essentially one person unnaturally stopping another parent from having a normal relationship with their child. And I'm sure we'll come into the why they do that in a moment, Alan. But what I do is I help parents through that experience of dealing with three key things, really. One, it's understanding what the child is experiencing. The second one is, how do you deal with the person who is stopping you from seeing your child? And the third one is, how do you deal with that? Because there's a lot of mental and emotional trauma that goes along with suddenly experiencing the loss of your child or having a very strained relationship with your child. How do you become a parental alienation coach? So that's a very good question. Simply, there isn't very much in the way of formal qualifications for being a parental alienation coach. And that stems from the fact that parental alienation as let's call it a pathology, so a real recognized condition that psychologists would recognize, it's still not recognized globally. So it's not recognized in the UK, in the US, in Australia, Ireland, most places. And this is because there are various interest groups who have stopped it from being recognized. We can also get into that, but that's quite a sensitive area. But as a result of that negative lobbying, it has meant that for the people who are genuinely experiencing parental alienation, and I've been through it personally as well, it's not being recognized by the authorities that determine real pathologies. So they have agreed that manipulation and coercion are real pathologies, but they haven't agreed that parental alienation is real. And as a result of that, there isn't any formal qualification that therapists or psychologists can undertake that would enable them to become a therapist, or as I'm labeling myself, a coach. And I label myself a coach because it is not still a recognized pathology. So it's quite a long-winded answer. But I've actually been through parental alienation myself, and it's such a traumatic experience that I don't really believe that people who haven't experienced it can really help others through that process, because they do not have that depth of understanding. So I've been through it. I've studied a lot in terms of the materials and the literature that is available and which is recognized. And there are some very good authors out there. But to your question, Alan, how do you become a parental alienation coach? And it's really down to having the experience and learning from the various sources that are available, and also being good with people. Frankly, if you're not good with people, then there's probably not the sort of career path that you should be following.
Yeah, I think every career you really need to be good with people. Because initially I went into the engineering world because I didn't like people, but then I found that the people I was on the workshop floor with were people, as were the parts department, as were the sales department, as was the boss, and just all the customers and everyone else. There are people everywhere. Even if you choose one of the careers where you hide from people, there are still people.
Absolutely.
So you said you've come through it, parental alienation, and experienced that yourself. Would that be as the parent or the alienated child?
As the parent. So in brief, I'm kind of happy to share some of that experience. There are several stages to alienation typically. The first one is what I would call pre-alienation. And this is where your other half, your spouse or your partner, has started to create negative stories about you as a person. So basically your relationship with them is typically beginning to break down, and they're looking to start developing, or they're encouraging the children to take sides as to, who is the favored parent. And in my instance, the pre-alienation process began, I know this sounds crazy, but I can point back to about a decade before the point in time that I finally separated from my ex. And most people will go through this experience as well. There'll be a period of pre-alienation, then there'll be an event that happens. Typically, it's actually when the relationship finally breaks down. And that's the moment that the alienating parent takes the opportunity to really try and turn the kids against you. So in my instance, it was at separation. My ex made considerable effort to put significant pressure onto my kids, and they found spending time with me very uncomfortable, just because any contact with me typically resulted in their mother complaining about it. She would punish them in various ways, typically psychologically, and it resulted in me having very limited contact with my kids and it was, you find that your kids have different experiences. My oldest child, I had a limited contact with her for probably 2.5, coming on 3 years. It was only really when she went to university, she had more independence from her mum, that I was able to start redeveloping that relationship. But for my younger child, it was more difficult. And as she was left as the only child in the house when my oldest daughter went to university, the alienation pressure was even greater. And we ended up having a period of no contact at all for pretty much 2 years, because anytime we were in each other's company, it was toxic and it was destructive. And essentially, my child was being kind of held as a pawn in the middle of a battlefield by my ex. And I had to make the very difficult decision of stop seeing her for a period of time to remove her from that position and just take the pressure off her. And it was quite difficult reestablishing relationships with her after that period, because we hadn't seen each other for 2 years. And also she had this negative narrative about me as a person for that entire duration. But thankfully, we started having some limited contact, and I've managed to rebuild that relationship with her again. but yes, I can only say for a parent going through this is a traumatic experience to suddenly be with your children and be a loving father one moment, and then suddenly being rejected by your children, and then being told stories about how you've abandoned them and all these other smear campaign, all of which is untrue. It is tremendously difficult, and it's very damaging for the kids because they start to believe aspects of what they're being told, and it's quite difficult for them to unbelieve it progressively. But that's part of their healing journey. Does that
sounds like a very challenging and complicated experience for in any relationship, but as a parent, when you've put so much into raising the children and loving them and everything else, to pretty much have to decide to walk away from it, that must be very, very a difficult decision to make.
Hugely difficult. And also at the point in time, and actually it's a very selfless thing to do for your child, because you're thinking what is best for them in sacrificing your relationship with them in order that, you love them so much, you just want what the best thing is for them. But it's a very difficult decision to make, because you don't know at that point if you'll ever be able to recover your relationship with your kid. But if you really love them, that's one of the absolute litmus tests. Am I prepared to unconditionally give them peace and calmness in their life? It's hard. It's hard.
So I'm guessing, as there's no sort of legal pathological thing that is parental alienation, it then makes it difficult to get any kind of help, assistance, guidance from the family court system.
Yes. And in fact, I would go to say just about every avenue that you might turn to, there seems to be an inability for people to help you. So it's a very isolating experience. And that's one of the things that's one of the emotions that parents often feel. So because, just to kind of expand upon that, Alan, the parental alienation is something that most people have never even heard of. And those of us who've experienced hadn't heard of it either. And we suddenly found ourselves in this world where our children are changing their behaviors, they're being held back from us, our exes are behaving in quite appalling ways, and we don't understand what's going on. And it can take people a period of time before they actually come across, normally by accident, that there is this thing called parental alienation. But because nobody knows about it, or not so much nobody knows about it, but very few people know about it, and it's not a recognized pathology, it means that social services are not trained up on this. The legal system is not trained up on this. The judges in the courts are not trained up on this. And in fact, the judges in the courts and the lawyers are both relying upon the expertise of the psychologists, who don't recognize it, to inform them and make recommendations about the best ways of handling these situations. And also for anybody who's got the responsibility for doing evaluations of what's actually happening with the kids and the parents, so they can make recommendations into the court system. And as a result of this, it means that nobody is really protecting the child and the parents in the way that they should. And it actually gets worse than this, because there is something called the voice of the child. So if your child is of a certain age, typically, and it depends around the world, but in most cases can be as young as 12, typically as close to 13, 14, the courts consider the child as being old enough to form their own opinion as to where they should spend some time. So they're given an element of choice. But this plays into the hands of the person who's alienating the child, because what they do is they put enormous pressure on the kid to typically make some sort of a statement, a testimony that goes into the judge, or it goes into whoever's doing the mediation, where the child feels under tremendous pressure to say that they want to spend the time with the person who is alienating them. And the people who receive these statements, because they're not trained to look beyond what is on a piece of paper or what the child, because children will even make testimonies in court where they would say, oh, I don't want to be with my dad, or I don't want to be with my mum. And it's because they're in a high pressure situation in home with the alienator. They're groomed before they turn up to the court, or they're groomed before they turn up to give testimony. And they're terrified of the consequences of not keeping the alienator happy. And for those of us who've been through alienation, you will appreciate that when we were living with them, we were constantly treading on eggshells, trying to keep that person on an even keel, keep them calm. And essentially, as we came out of that relationship, our children stepped into that role. And now they're the people who are trying to keep that parent calm. And so they're walking on all the eggshells, and they're protecting themselves by letting their relationship with us, the target parents, be damaged and not having the contact with us. It's a very complicated area, but I'm sure we'll touch upon more of this as we progress through this conversation.
Yeah, sounds very much as though only those who have experienced it are clued up on it.
Absolutely. And I think that that even extends to our own family members, because I use the example of bereavement when I'm helping parents with parental alienation, because it's a very similar journey where you start with shock, then you go through denial, you go through anger, bargaining, then into depression, and finally into acceptance. Except it's not like a death in that you can get to a point of acceptance. In this instance, your kid is still alive, and so acceptance is very different in terms of you're accepting the reality of your situation, but they're still with you. But for the people around you who want to love and support you, so typically your own family and your friends, they cannot understand what you are experiencing. So they're not in a position to help you. They're not able to give you the support that you need. In fact, you end up supporting the people around you through their own trauma journey of alienation, because as an alienated parent, what typically happens to you is that all of your family now get excluded from your children's life, because that's another mechanism for the alienator to hurt you. And that's what they're trying to do. They're just trying to hurt you, and they'll do anything to hurt you. So your family is going through the same trauma. They don't understand it. In fact, they can be part of the problem, because if your own parents, so the kids' grandparents, for instance, if they see the kids and say, oh, I don't like the way that you're treating your dad, or I don't like the way you're treating your mum, that is actually upsetting to the kids. And those comments by those grandparents, or your brothers or your sisters, your own siblings, can end up pushing your own children away. So you have to coach your family through the trauma and how to deal with these kids. I mean, it's just a crazy situation. And for us parents, what gets even worse is that some of the people that we know, and especially for men, less so, in fact, this works a lot for women as well, they think that we've done something wrong, such that our kids are not wanting to see us, or our kids are being kept away from us. And in some instances, we start receiving the blame for this alienation, which just adds insult to the injury of what we're experiencing. And I think it's particularly hard for women, because they are put into this quite shameful position from their perspective of, wow, my friends think I'm the person who's responsible for this because I must have done something wrong. How is it possible that a mother is not having a normal relationship with her kids? So we're really left to our own devices as an alienated parent to kind of navigate our way through this. But that's what this conversation is about. It's all about how to help parents.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a lot of crossover between parental alienator and a narcissist.
There is. I call them nurtured narcissists, because they're not born narcissists. They've become narcissists because of the environment that they've been put in. Now, this is an area that will be a little bit uncomfortable for an alienating or alienated parent. So let's just call them the target parent, because the pain that we experience at the hands of the alienator makes it very difficult for us to be compassionate towards them. And actually, I do advocate compassion because that's one of the anger emotions that we have. And the anger only hurts us. It doesn't actually hurt the alienator. And in fact, the alienator wants you to be angry with them because they know it's going to hurt you. But most of the people who become alienators have, I see the same patterns again and again and again, which is they've been through some experience themselves when they were younger. And a lot of this comes from their own childhood. They've suffered trauma at the hands of somebody else. They've never dealt with that trauma. They've suppressed it. They then come into adulthood in a slightly stunted state of growth. So they don't fully mature, and they're very insecure. They're very vulnerable. And their coping mechanisms for this is bullying, coercion. They get moody very quickly. They're very uncompromising. They're not really parents because they're still so focused on protecting themselves that very often they don't have the ability and the humanity to really be a good parent for their own children. And so I keep seeing the same characteristics appearing in the alienators. And the reason why I say we should be compassionate for them is they are actually victim of trauma that somebody else has put them through at an earlier point in their own lives. And so their narcissistic tendencies is all about their self-protection and just looking after themselves at the expense of everybody else in order that they don't repeat that trauma. And that trauma is has been so challenging for them to deal with that they're even prepared to sacrifice their children's well-being in order to protect themselves as the alienating parent.
So it's like a form of attack being the best form of defense.
Absolutely, yeah. And these are people that would drop the atomic bomb in order to defend themselves. That they often don't really have many boundaries, but also they will take actions that for the targeted parent, they start doing things that we don't anticipate. So the alienators, in the same way that they started to turn the children against us quite early on in the process of our relationships with the alienator beginning to disintegrate, they turn around to everybody else as well. So they will turn around to all of our friends and tell them what a bad person we are. And it's amazing how people are hoodwinked and suddenly believe that we have, transformed from Jekyll into Hyde on the basis of just no evidence. They typically get all of their own families against us. So those families are now repeating the same mantra and the same negative narrative to the kids. So the kids have now got multiple people telling them the same set of lies and contrived stories about us. And they will go out, they'll reach out to the schools and tell the schools that there's lots of false allegations that go on as well. They often accuse us of domestic violence. They accuse us of sexual abuse, psychological abuse. It's all contrived. But they'll go out to the schools, persuade the schools we're bad people, take us off the school's records. They will try and take us off the medical records at the GP. They basically tried to eradicate us from the children's lives. And we don't anticipate this because that's not the way that we think. And so we're constantly reacting to the activities, the actions of the alienator, these negative actions they're taking against us.
You say compassion is a very powerful tool against them because they don't want us to get angry. What else can the target parent do, firstly, to protect themselves, but also to limit the damage to the relationship between themselves and the children?
So your So that's one of the three key focus areas that I help parents with. You really have to get into the mindset of the alienator and see where they're coming from. And it's a bit like playing a game of chess. It's you want to be a few moves ahead of what they're going to do next. And the good thing about the alienators is that in many ways they are very predictable. So they've got particular trigger points, and whenever you trigger them, they increase the level of alienation against your kids. So the first kind of key tip for people is try not to poke the bear, because the bear is going to attack your kids. So the things that will trigger alienators is, first of all, your relationship with them. So if your relationship has deteriorated, that's a trigger for them. That's when the alienation starts. When you separate, that's when they start the full alienation. As you go through the divorce process, this is a period of high insecurity for them. And as I've said before, these are very insecure, very vulnerable people. So not only have you exited their life and you were a crutch, they now don't know how much, what their world is going to look like. Are they going to get custody of the children? What's their financial position going to be like? And that's actually the third trigger. Anything to do with money. So anything to do with courts, and obviously divorce has a lot of court activity with it, or associated with its legal, anything legal stroke court. Money is a really big issue for them. So if they feel threatened in that capacity, again, they'll increase the alienation against the kids. If you get into a new relationship, they feel very threatened that they feel very jealous, first of all, that you're now with somebody else. And their intention was to make your life miserable, and that they didn't want you to be with anybody else. They don't want to be with you, but they don't want anybody else to be with you. So when you get into a relationship, they're jealous about that. And then they also get very angry about the fact that you might be introducing their children to somebody who might be an influence in their life, who might be a future stepmother or a future stepfather. So again, the insecurities and the vulnerabilities come out. And another big trigger for them is, if you're having a good relationship with your kids, they will seek to undermine it. So you're constantly going through that, especially in the early years of alienation. There's a lot of these really big speed bumps that you have to get over. So you have to get through the divorce, minimizing the damage that they're trying to do to the kids. If you're going to get into a relationship with somebody else, which I would advocate, I think that's a good thing to get into relationships, but try and do it in a way, ideally, that you're not involving your kids, or you're having a relationship with somebody who's not, local and doesn't know your ex, because that's just going to cause you a lot of issues. And equally, be aware that any of those triggers are going to increase alienation with your kids. Also be aware these are very uncompromising people. They're not going to try to co-parent with you. But also it's important that you have boundaries, because the alienators still want to control you, even though you're no longer in the relationship. And they will constantly do things to press your buttons. So you're talking about how do you protect yourself? You need to be really aware of who you are. Who are you, the person who's come into this experience? Because we all have our own insecurities and vulnerabilities as well. And these, we've done a great job at oppressing those, but they all bubble back up to the surface. And the alienators know what our vulnerabilities are, and they will press those buttons all the time to try and upset us. So you have to go through a healing process of understanding what your triggers are, and ideally dealing with them, but at a minimum, not making that button available to the alienator anymore. And this really irritates the alienators, which is not a good thing, but what it does is it defangs them. So they look for other ways in which to try and hurt you. And you have to keep progressively exhausting those options for them so that they can't upset your mental state. But also for your kids, you need to be really, as I say, you need to be very aware of what is going to be hurtful to the alienator, and ideally avoid those situations. So, especially when you're dealing with the alienator, if there's a more pleasant way of getting what you want without angering them, I would take that approach. Because if you anger them, and they always want to have arguments with you, do not get involved in the arguments, because they'll just take it out on the kids. Or if you do things that, you want to have time with the kids or whatever, do it in a way that's not going to get them irritated, because they'll just take it out on the kids and then they won't let you see the kids. So it's a very long-winded answer, but it's quite an open question.
Yeah. I don't like short answers a lot of the time. Also, it gives a better opportunity to understand what this is all about. So, to not poke the bear, if you say a guy is in a position where he's got 2 teenage kids and the mum's messing around with the contact, but saying, oh, it's because it's what the kids want, whereas the kids tell a very, very different story. And then you've got some of the manipulation, the stories about what daddy might do to his daughter and all those kind of things. If those stories get into the wrong hands, then he can't see his kids, potentially locked up.
Yeah.
So because it's a thing that can't be proved in court, it's his word against hers.
Mm-hmm.
Going down the court road will poke the bear, as you say.
Absolutely. Because
So
you're making you feel insecure. Yep.
Yeah. Would you suggest something like giving the alienator, saying, look, this is a kind of contact I would like to have with our children, or the children would like, versus the let's go to court and embarrass you and you're not going to like that? But then is that then lowering themselves to the alienator's perspective and putting ultimatums and things which doesn't necessarily end well?
So it's a piece of string question, but I can answer that for you. So the alienation is pretty much on a spectrum. So at one end, you get parents who are a bit aggrieved, and they might be going through a divorce, and that they're angry and they're taking it out on the kids, but actually they're what I would call a naive alienator. That they're not intentionally trying to destroy your relationship with your kid. They're just a bit peeved with you at that point in time. So those are people who you can rationalize with, and you can have a conversation about what's best for the kids. The other end of the spectrum are the severely alienated kids, whereby the person alienating you is just absolutely adamant that they are going to do everything in their power to stop you having a relationship with your kids. You cannot have a normal conversation with those people. And if you ask for time with the kids, they see that as a sign of them winning. And they glorify in the fact that you are in this relatively powerless situation whereby they've basically taken control of the kids. They will tell you things like, oh, I've asked David or I've asked Rebecca, and I'm encouraging them to see you, but they say to me, no, I don't want to spend time with dad. It's they just don't want to see you. I'm sorry, I've done everything I can to help you. And what's really going on is that they're encouraging, especially for teenagers, because they know that the teenagers have got this voice of the child. They basically tell the kids that, you're old enough to make your own decisions. You don't need to see your dad, or you don't need to see your mum if you don't want to. So they give them this option. And then because they're putting so much pressure on the kids, they then it's quite an evil thing to do. They then give the kid a choice to see you or not see you. And guess what? The kid elects not to see you because the kid's kind of trying to protect themselves from what happens next, which is they end up making the alienator unhappy, and the kid will get punished. So everybody is basically stuck in this loop of trying not to make the alienator angry, because everybody's going to get punished as a result of it.
Lesser of two evils, so to speak.
Well, so I mean, the other option that parents have, which is one I would not advocating following. So if you're a target parent, you can try and retaliate, but it's a bit like us only having cannons and the alienating parent having the atomic bomb. They will drop that bomb. They will not stop at anything that we do. They will always try to go one step further in order to retain the control of the children. And we intuitively recognize this as the target parent when we're dealing with the alienators. And that is one of the things that makes us feel so powerless, because it's like, well, okay, I can't use authority and I can't use being nice. So what do I do? Which is where people typically turn to the courts, but the court system doesn't serve and protect us properly because they don't understand alienation. But the courts is also, if your kid is in their teen years, the voice of the child will come back in. So you're probably not going to win the court case anyway. For the majority of people, their best chance is, if they're going to go to court, is to try and get in there early before the kids are 12, 13 years old, and to lock in some arrangements until they're kind of 18 years old. But expect that even then, the alienator, once kids get into their kind of teens, the alienator is going to encourage them to be in breach of those court orders. And apologies to any parents listening to this. It's a very depressing subject, but it's much better to deal with the reality and accept this in a way that you can then take, and there are positive steps that you can take, but then take the positive steps that are available to you, which includes how you deal with it as a parent. But I mean, I talked earlier about there are three things that you need to focus on. One is dealing with the alienators, and we've covered that to some degree. The first one is you really need to get your heads around understanding how alienation operates, because it is very counterintuitive, and you have to understand what your child is going through. And for most parents, we find this really difficult because the behaviors that our children exhibit towards us can change very rapidly. And it's because this period of pre-alienation has been quite extensive. And when the alienators kind of hit full alienation mode, our children's behaviors change very fast. So we don't understand why it is that a child is loving to us one day and next day is rejecting us, or they suddenly start calling us by our first name, or they're very rude and disrespectful for us. Some kids even turn into mini spies for the alienating parent in order they can go back and report on them. Or kids will come up with their false testimonies, or they'll say, I've been abused by the target parent, which is completely untrue. But this is all happening because our child is typically in a fear-based relationship with the alienating parent. And so our children are protecting themselves by playing the game that the alienator wants them to play, because they know that the alienator will punish them. They might even cut them out of their lives. Whereas we, the target parents, we're nicer people. We're more empathetic. We have unconditional love. We are not going to do things that are harmful to the kids. But we need to be able to see through, if a kid's being disrespectful to us, firing back and being really angry with a kid is not necessarily the answer. That can potentially push your child away from you. What that child really wants from you is your love and support. But they're not able to articulate that in a way that says, look, I'm in this terrifying place. I really need your love and support. They show us these negative behaviors. It sounds like you might have experienced some of this yourself, Alan.
It does sound a little bit familiar. As I do remember when we first had the children, you get one of the triggers was because at that time we could get two child support things. So I set it up so the bigger one went into her account, and the other one went into mine, which was, I think it's about £10 a month or something. And because all the nappies and whatever else got paid for out of my account when I went and did all the shopping. And yes, that went down a bit like the Titanic. And so I came home to telling the kids that are only, 2 months old at the time, "Oh, Daddy, they don't love you and Daddy doesn't love you." I thought, what are you on about? That's crazy. And then later on at night said, "You should have put that into my account because they're my kids." So, no, they're our kids. No, they're mine. So, oh, right, okay.
The alienators tend to extend ownership over children. And the reality is none of us own our kids. Our kids will be independent people at some point in time. They're not material things that we own. But for the alienators, there is a sense of need for control because they're trying to control so many different aspects of their life in order that they don't get hurt as an alienator. So it's better to control and manipulate everything around you as best you can. But yeah, it's shocking it's shocking the trauma that our kids are put through. And one of the other things that often happens to the children is they become what they call parentified or adultified. So when we were in the relationship with the narcissistic person, the alienator, and we were the people who were keeping the calm environment for everybody in order to make it, a secure environment as a household, as we step out of that environment, somebody has got to step into that vacuum because we're no longer there to protect the kids. So the kids start becoming their own protectors. And very often it's the older kid who ends up taking on that role, trying to protect the younger kids. But the kids also, and again, it's very often just one of them, and typically the old child can become the confidant of the alienating parent. So the alienating parent is sharing all the details with them about the divorce, all of the details about the money, but the alienating parent is spinning their version of reality rather than what's really going on. And the child also realizes that the person who is supposed to be their parent is not as capable of looking after them as they had hoped. And they start becoming parents to their own mum or their own dad. And this process of adultification changes their whole relationship with adults. It also changes their relationship with you as the target parent, because they tie you with the same brush. They look up at the alienator and say, well, hang on a minute, all parents are like that. So you suddenly start to notice your kids treating you in a very different way, and they want to parent you. And it's a very strange phenomenon, and you're powerless to do much about it, because very often you have very limited contact with them, or they're very angry with you, or you have no contact at all. So it's a horrible situation for the kids to be in this sort of parentified world, and they bring that with them into their own adult lives, kind of having this expectation that they now have to look after, the people around them. It's a horrible position for our kids to be placed in.
And take care of everyone effectively.
Yeah. And it also can affect them going forwards, because they become the new dad or the new mum in that family. And their relationship with their siblings changes enormously as well, to the point that as they get older, when they reach adulthood, when all of your children reach adulthood, this kind of bizarre relationship often stays in place, that the older child has this position of, authority over the other siblings. And in a lot of instances, that can stay in place for long periods afterwards. And it's not fair on the kids. It's like they're having their childhood stolen from them. And so I was just going to give you an example of the sorts of things that, so real life experience. When I separated from my ex, And it's interesting, she told my children that I'd abandoned her, when the reality is that she'd put keys in all the doors in order that I couldn't actually access the property to get in. And I contacted the police and said, can you come along and resolve this? Because this is crazy. I can't actually get into the house. Everything I own is inside here. And the police just said, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. And I said, well, look, how about if I just break in? And they said, well, if you break in, then we'd have to come and arrest you because you're now causing a disturbance. So I'm sorry, you need to leave the property. So I had to leave the property and literally go and buy, new clothes in order that I could go to work the next day and continue to put on some semblance of functioning normally. But as we were going through the whole divorce, my ex would do things like she would take, because I had to provide bank statements and credit card statements. I had to go move into a new apartment. So there was 1 month where I'd furnished an apartment, a 3-bed apartment. So it was for me and my 2 kids. Little did I know that they would spend virtually no time there ever. That's another lesson that you learn. But I spent whatever it was, £5,000 or something. I think it was pretty modest to have furnished this whole apartment. And that was the statement that she produces to the kids and says, look, your dad's giving us no money, but he's spending £5,000 a month on himself. And the kids just look at this, they're young, they don't know any better. And to this day, some of that kind of trauma and that my dad abandoned me and he only cares about himself still resides within my kid's head, or both my children's head. And it's completely contrived, made up nonsense. The reality was I paid my ex just shy of 20 grand. When I separated from her, I paid her 20 grand. I was paying all the bills on the house. And I said, you don't need to worry about money. Sorted. That's like, you should be okay for 6 months. All you need to pay out of this is basically food and some clothing. You should be absolutely fine. She spent all that money within 6 weeks and then told the kids that I was giving them no cash, and then presents this credit card statement of what I was supposedly spending. I mean, it's just these are the sorts of horror stories that I'm sure you and other parents, targeted parents, experience.
Yeah, I did get told at one point that I didn't pay their mum any money. And so, well, okay, that's fine. Just have a look at this bank statement. Now let's have a look on the child maintenance calculator on the government website. And I was paying over double what I should be compared to what I earn. I've never heard any more about that again.
But also, I mean,
from the mother, but
yeah, I mean, we try. It's so hard, and this is a core mistake for parents. If as a target parent, there is this strong sense of the injustice of what is happening to you and what is being told about you and what the children are being told about you. And so when you do have time with the children, we have this irresistible urge almost to correct the narrative. And actually this ends up shooting us in the foot, because on the one side, we want to set the record straight, but the kids have come from an environment where they're getting all this negative narrative about you. They can go to your house and they get all this negative narrative, which a lot of it is true, about their other parent. And the kids do not want, they're stuck in the middle. So they don't have a choice about being with the alienator. They do have more of a choice about being with you. So guess what? They will exercise that choice, which the alienator is absolutely delighted about. So do not be critical about the alienators. Do not start trying to address that injustice. And this is one of the most important things for any parent to overcome, is this sense of injustice. And as I say to a parent, you've got 2 choices. You can correct the injustice, or you can have a relationship with your kids. chances are you can't do both. And you might get an opportunity at a later point in time, because your kids, that's the other thing, your kids do not want to talk about their alienation experience. Do not discuss this with them. It's a surefire way of pushing your kids away from you. So don't do it. You might get an opportunity at some stage, much later on in life, to have a conversation about what happened in the past. And you can kind of tell how your relationship with your kids is developing when they are reuniting with you and that relationship is rebuilding, because they will feel a little bit more comfortable telling you about some of the experience and what they've been through as a child. That's not an invitation to say, oh, I've been waiting for this moment for 10 years. And, they dip a toe in the water and you hit them with this kind of tsunami of all this stuff that's been pent up with you for years. It's like, no, okay, you just send your kids away from you again.
Drip by drip.
Yeah, you just have to listen. Don't come up with any opinions. Again, this is understanding the child's perspective. They're telling you stuff because they want you to sympathize with them. They don't want you to launch into having your needs met. And that's a really important point, because when we experience alienation, we're going through our own suffering. And I call it the two universe model. You have to distinguish between what are my needs as an adult with all of my insecurities. So I'm now looking to the kids to love me because I'm feeling rejected. I'm looking to the kids for approval of what I do. This is all the wrong way round in terms of how a relationship with a child should be. And also we're feeling all the injustice, and I'd feel deeply offended about what's happening to me. And we're trying to correct that with the kids. So when the kids are coming to us, they need our love, they need our support. And what's happening is there are two sets of needs that are clashing. And we as parents have to put our needs to one side and heal our needs in order that we can focus on our kids. And so when your kids do start talking about their experience of parental alienation, potentially years later, you still have to play that same game. You have to listen and support them for what they need from you, not you offloading onto the kids. That's not your role as parent. Your role as parent is to listen. So that can be very hard for us. And also, don't expect it to happen anytime soon. I'm 14 years in, 24 years if you include the pre-alienation period, but 14 years post. My kids still have a lot of that narrative, the misconstrued narrative locked into their heads. They still say things like, oh, you abandoned us. And I know that I can't retaliate even now, because that would just push them away. At some point, when they're ready, they'll go through their own healing journey, and they'll come to realize gradually, bit by bit, what's actually come to pass. In fact, there's a very inspiring young American woman who's on YouTube. I think it's called the AlienationProject. Her name's Maddie Madison. And she realized when she was in her mid-20s and had children herself, that was the penny dropping moment for her as to what had been going on with her life as a child. And she now no longer has contact with her mum, because her mum effectively alienated her from her dad. The mum didn't succeed in alienating all three children. She had two brothers. The mum only focused her attention on alienating Maddie. And so Maddie was left in this kind of massively confusing space of, how come my brothers are getting on so well with my dad, but I don't have this relationship with him? And it took her a long time to realize this was all coming from her mum. But, she was 25 when that happened. My kids are coming on 31 and 29. And they've done a lot of healing. They've made some really, really good progress. I have a good relationship with them, but there is still these underlying scars that I have to wait for them to go through their healing process. I'm not part of that healing process. My part is to listen and give them the support. I've had to do my own healing separately, which is the second part of those three things, just a reminder, also the third part of those three things, the first one is understand alienation, get into your child's headset, understand what your child is experiencing, and be the parent who changes themselves to support your child. The second one is, as we were talking about, the alienators, changing your tactics to deal with the alienators in such ways as it minimizes the damage they're doing to your kids and to you. And the third one is your own healing. But I'll just take a break there for a second and ask you, Alan, what you've been doing on your healing journey, and then I'll come in with some thoughts and ideas as well.
Wow. Well, I've actually been on a healing journey much longer than I've been through this parental alienation journey. First come across personal development when I was 18. I thought, no, I don't need that. And a couple of years later, I was actually, maybe I do. And
we all need it.
Yeah. So I've had, I don't know how many coaching sessions, whether it's a coach, whether it's NLP, whether it's hypnotherapy, kinesiology, all of this stuff, even to the point of writing my own book. It's like a case of just get the stuff out there and try and make some sense of it all.
So it's, I think for parents beginning to experience alienation, they typically, one of the main things they'll suffer is a version of grief that is unique to alienation. So we're all familiar with bereavement grief. And as I was saying at the beginning, that's a kind of similar experience that I tend to use with parents. But it's different insofar as you're grieving the time that you've already lost with your kids. You're grieving the time that you don't have with them currently. And you're also grieving the time that you anticipate you're not going to have with them in the future. And so that's hard for parents to deal with. There's also a lot of sense of guilt. Did I do enough? Should I have stayed in the marriage? What more could I have done for my kids? And most of the time, this sense of guilt is us feeling overly responsible, whereas in reality, the person who's doing all the damage is the alienator. We've talked about injustice. That's an enormous one for most people to deal with. It's like, I can't believe this is happening. How is this possible? Well, look what's happening to my kids. And then linked to that as well is the anxiety and the fear of, how is this going to affect my kids? What's happening to my kids right now? Are they suffering being in this environment? We also feel isolation, because as we were saying before, nobody else around you seems to be able to help you. The legal system, the social services, your friends, family, lawyers, all of them seem completely ineffective. And what happens is we end up getting caught in this emotional roller coaster. So our alienating partners put us on this emotional roller coaster by making us feel all of those things in the first instance. And this is where it gets a bit crazy. We then become the people that self-sustain those feelings potentially over years. Now, it's bonkers because the alienator kind of walks away. They know that they've done this damage to us, but you're the person left with the grief, the frustration, the isolation, the injustice, the guilt, the anxiety, and you're the only person who can heal from that. And on top of all that, most parents feel this sort of trauma bond with their kids, whereby they have it in their heads, unless I put my life on hold, unless I'm sad, and unless I'm depressed, my kid who's being alienated from me is not going to understand that I love them, I care for them, I miss them. And actually what you're doing, I did say a little bit earlier, alienation is counterintuitive. You're actually guilt tripping your kids when you do that, because when they see you, you're sad and depressed and you're miserable, and your kids in part recognize that they are to some degree responsible for what's happening to you, because they're making choices as well, and their choice has been protect themselves and not see you or have this strained relationship with you. And so your kids will get guilt tripped. Guess what? They won't want to see you. So one of the harder things for us to do, but it's really important that we do it, is that we embrace life, that we get back into the saddle, that we start doing the things that are healthy for us, that we love ourselves, that we reinvent our lives, and that, I'm going to use this word, happy. I want all of you, everybody, to be happy, because when you're happy, when you're confident, when you're strong, you can help your kid. When you're sad, when you're depressed, when you're insecure, when you're vulnerable, when all of those personal needs that you have about feeling safe haven't been addressed, you can't help your kid, because you're focusing on you.
It goes back to the aeroplane analogy where they say, always stick your oxygen mask on before you help anyone else.
Absolutely. So you and we all have triggers and blockers. So as you're going along this kind of emotional journey, you'll have triggers, which are the things that are going to send you into a reactive state. And you have blockers, which is what are the things that are stopping you from moving forwards in your own healing journey. So the personal development that you were just touching upon earlier, that is so important to really engage with. And again, that's something that I help a lot of parents with, because it's not, the first thing is, who is the version of Alan that came into this experience called parental alienation? Because all of your past traumas, that all came with you. So you need to know, if you've got your own insecurities, what are those insecurities? How are they affecting you today? How is it affecting your relationship with your kid? And also, how is it affecting the alienator's ability to keep you to keep you in that kind of depressed state? So you really need to get what I call conscious thinking, because it's all about what goes on up here. If you change what you're thinking up there, literally the world around you will change, because you've determined to experience it in a different way. And it's just you thinking differently, but it affects your thoughts, affect your emotions, and your thoughts affects your subconscious affects your thoughts. But what you really want to do is get into what is the blueprint of, what's the blueprint of Alan? Because all this, our minds instinctively turn to our subconscious for how do I deal with any situation?
Yeah.
And our subconscious is full of bad memories where things didn't work out for us in the past. So we end up assuming that if something didn't go well in the past, it's not going to go well in the future. So it's a bit like if you go to court and it didn't work and you get a letter to go back to court, your whole physiology will change immediately, because you'll look at it, you'll get fearful, you'll think, oh God, I'm going to go through this again, and I'm going to lose, and it's going to be terrible, and it's going to cost me all this money, and. That's fear. And there is no reason to believe that just because it happened in the past, it's going to happen again in the future. And we get stuck in this. So we are constantly looking back to past experiences, and it's a bit like trying to drive your car by looking in the rear view mirror.
Yeah.
You can't do it. You have to take the rear view mirror away. Look out of the windscreen. See what's in front of you. Start making decisions based on what's in front of you, not what's behind you. And again, this is part of your healing process, because if you're constantly having this dialogue in your head about fear, loss, anger, grief, injustice, then that's where you'll stay. You have to start giving yourself something in the future. Take yourself out of the past. That's happened. That's already gone. You can't do anything about the past. You can change the future. So again, this is why I encourage parents to start thinking about, okay, how am I going to reinvent myself? Because you do have to reinvent yourself.
Oh, definitely.
You're being dropped from a great height by the alienator. You've hit the ground. You've smashed into 1,000 pieces. Please do not put yourself back the way you were, because that's not going to help you. You have to say, okay, who do I need to be going forwards? Who do I need to be for me? Who do I need to be for my kids? Your whole relationship with your kids has changed. Recognize it. Start doing things differently. For a lot of parents, if they have limited contact with their kids going forwards, and their kids are like in their teens, it's like you becoming an empty nester 5 or 6 years earlier. So it's like if you had naturally gone through the process of your kids leaving you, going to university or getting a job, moving out of the home, that would all feel normal. You've been robbed of that experience, but you're now in effect an empty nester. So what are you going to do differently as an empty nester, as opposed to holding on to this kind of idea of who you are as a parent, the idea of what the past was like, and expecting that to repeat itself going forwards? For the vast majority of us, that's not going to happen. Our world has changed. It's like, wake up, recognize that. And I don't mean that harshly. It's like, please, I entreat every parent, become aware of what has changed in your life so that you can take steps that are really positive.
Yeah. I remember thinking back to, I think it was about a year after we'd separated, and I got another relationship after that, and that one failed. And I found myself in a position where I was kneeling on the living room floor of my house that I couldn't afford to live in. I couldn't sell because she'd got a claim on it through the courts. And the mortgage company or the bank said, you can't rent it out. And I was in full-time in my own business, but it was only providing a smart part-time income. It's like, now what? What am I going to do? So I'll put some music on to try and change my state and just do something. And I've no idea why I put these 2 CDs on, but I did. I was given to them in Australia by a guy called Mike Tramp. And on the first CD, there's a song called You Can't Take My Rock and Roll. He says, you can take my money, you can take my fancy car, you can take the bed I sleep in, but you cannot take away the rock and roll. It's like, I can relate to that. So I'll put the other one on there, and there's this song called Loser, where he's singing about is his son better off now that his father is dead, and his mother was never what a mother should be. And I thought, is he singing about my kids in the future? And that really hit me like a train. It's like, I don't know what I'm going to do, how I'm going to do it, but I've got to be the best dad that I can be to not only make sense of this situation, but to add value to the kids. So at that point, I hired a coach, paid to go to Tony Robbins' UPW that I couldn't afford to go to, but I couldn't afford not to. So, and while I was there, I heard him talking about making the worst day of your life the best day of your life. So many times throughout this journey, I was like, okay, this has been a really shit time. How can I make it the best for me? How can I use this to serve me, serve my kids, and learn and grow from it?
Oddly, that is one of the positive aspects of alienation, because from that kind of place of rock bottom, there's only one direction, and that's up. And the only question is, when are you going to take those steps? And for a lot of people, they put off taking those steps because they want to do this whole sad and depressed state. But in reality, it's a really good opportunity for people, if they choose to take it, to say, okay, I'm actually out. Yes, this terrible thing called alienation is happening to me, and it's happening to my kids, but I'm out of a very toxic relationship. And how am I going to make the best of what's available to me? How am I going to make the best of my life going forwards? As you say, to be the best dad, but also for yourself, because you have to focus on your own needs. And I would just say also with relationships, whilst advocating people to get into relationships and also recognizing, be very careful about your ex finding out about them, et cetera, don't compromise, because a lot of us, we're nice people, but we can be in a slightly vulnerable state. We might not want to be by ourselves. We're looking for other people to kind of be around and support us, but do not get into the next relationship with somebody else who's unsuitable for you. So avoid rebounds. And what I suggest to people is, and it sounds strange, particularly women find this strange, but I advocate it for everybody. Spend some time and write down what's really important to you in terms of what you want from a relationship. Who is it that you want to be in a relationship with? And in particular, what are your red lines? So, if you have, for me, my red lines were, they've got to be spiritual, because I've been with somebody else who was not spiritual before, and that didn't work. And as in my ex wasn't. And the second one was, I wanted to travel. So two absolute, not prepared to compromise. They had to be spiritual, and they had to be prepared to travel. They had to want to travel, not be prepared to travel. They had to be something that they are, excited about and advocating. And I had a bunch of other points as well. And I just kept filtering people. And I wouldn't go off on dates, and I wouldn't meet people. I'd only go on a date if I thought there was actually a chance that this person was going to be right for me, and that I wouldn't know what they wanted, but hopefully I was going to be right for them. And you find out when you go for a date. But otherwise,
definitely. Yeah, it's one of the things I did for myself farther on down the line with dating, and it's something I recommend for my clients as well, especially if they're meeting online, which seems to be the way these days, is a first meeting, 20-minute cup of coffee, just to get the answer to the question, do I want to spend 3 hours with this person? Because if you don't want to spend 3 hours with them, you've got no chance of a long-term relationship.
Yeah. No, it's it's a really, and also I love your idea, because it doesn't, the cup of coffee doesn't involve romantic expectations that going for dinner or something else has. It just takes the pressure off. It's brilliant. And you can both walk away feeling either very excited about seeing each other again, or saying, no, I'm really glad I did that. That was kind of the wrong, it's the wrong person for me. And actually there's no real rights or wrongs. It's just finding the right person for you. The person you get will be ideal for somebody else, and vice versa. Yeah,
because the way I look at it, which is actually included in the logo, is having the mind, body, and soul in alignment, being heart-centered, and being balanced between the masculine and feminine energies. And once you're in that version of yourself, then question, okay, who is going to be attracted to this? Not what am I attracted to? Because that keeps you stuck in your head and you attract the wrong people.
Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it. I do think that the kind of the soul side is an important aspect of finding who your soul partner is. And on that note, I'm very happy to say that I got remarried, 3 years ago.
Excellent.
Yeah, it was really good. We were together. So I've been together with Emma for 12 years this October. So in fact, I'll be into 15 years of alienation this October. Not October, but 15 years early next year. So yeah, it took kind of coming on 3 years to find the right person. And that's no time at all. Realistically, to find somebody who you can then hopefully spend the rest of your life with, it's worth it.
How did you meet Emma?
Online, because as you rightly say, there's when I was younger, and the way I met my first wife, I was, in my early 20s. I knew lots of people. There was always lots of parties and social events, and it was kind of very rich environment in terms of meeting potential people that you might want to settle down with. But that tends not to be the way when you get older. People don't go out they're not going, you don't know the same groups of people who are young, free and single, all going out and enjoying themselves. Our world has changed. And I would strongly advocate to people not taking the lazy option of the girl next door or the boy next door or the people that at work. That's kind of, it's all a bit close to home. I'd say, look down the internet route. But again, filter. My shortest date which wasn't a coffee date, it was a drinks date in the evening, 15 minutes. That was a toughie. That was a toughie. But I was determined in myself. I thought the last time I'd been out dating people, I was a young pup in my mid-20s. And most parents will suddenly find themselves back kind of where they last left off as their point of reference as to, how you deal with dating. And in fact, no, I'd been with my ex probably from my early 20s. And, most men are idiots in their early 20s. And, because they're lacking confidence, and they say things like, I'll phone you and I'll do this. And we just leave a string of women in our wake, poor people who've got all these, inflated promises that we give them. And I just thought, I'm never doing that again. I'm treating everybody with respect. It's going to be painful, but I'm going to take it on the chin. And if I met with somebody, I'd be really polite and I'd be really honest with them. And I would just say, I'm sorry. And sometimes it would take a couple of hours to be sure that this was the wrong thing for me.
Yeah.
In this case, I recognized it in 15 minutes and I thought, I'm not going to waste her time. I felt really bad because she got dressed up, and I'm not going to waste my time. And I just apologized profusely. I'm sure she was really angry with me, but she would only have been angry for a short period of time rather than me being dishonest, basically, and leading her along and having no intention of seeing her again. I thought, I'm not doing it. And I felt really crappy, but only for a short period. By the next day, I felt proud that I'd actually been honest.
Yeah.
Because I think it's, we're adults.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, it's better to be slapped in the face by a truth than kissed by a lie.
Well, and also the longer you put off, if you don't like the person, the longer you put off kind of extricating yourself from it, the harder it gets.
Yeah.
So just don't,
Definitely.
and I think that was one of the biggest lessons from alienation. I'm not going to put myself through that again. I have choice. I'm going to exercise my choice. I'm going to use my choices a lot more carefully than I used to in the past.
Yeah. Yes, we're taught to be selfless and caring, but we're not necessarily told to stand up for ourselves, have boundaries, stay in line with our values, and all those kind of things that should never be compromised for anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, compromise over where we're going for dinner tonight, but over the boundaries and values, not a chance.
And that's where we made the mistakes when we married the people that we did. I mean, and for any alienated parent out there, the one thing you can and should take responsibility for is, you probably saw some warning bells going off, and for whatever reason, you decided to stick with it, and you ended up with the person who subsequently ruined your life and is mucking up your kids. The reality is, they were going to do it to whoever they got into that relationship with. So it's not actually about you. You're not at fault for what subsequently happened. You're only at fault for being the person who's sitting in your shoes right now, because you probably, for whatever reason, decided that, you could fix this problem. And it's one of the lessons you learn. You cannot fix people. People have to fix themselves if that's what they want to do. And that's also part of the healing issue, is that for a lot of parents, they're really angry about what's happened. When you're really angry, you're not in a place to be healed. You physically can't do it. And so when I'm looking to work with parents, I speak with all of them before I agree to take them on. And I assess whether or not they are somebody who can help themselves with my support. And if they can't help themselves, then I'm sorry, I very politely decline them, because they're not ready, and they're wasting their time and money and my time.
Yeah, you can only teach a willing student, as they say.
Absolutely. And also they literally will not be able to hear what you're telling them in a way that would be helpful for them, that they can bring about change in their lives.
Yeah, because they've got too much focus on the external. It's his fault, her fault, whatever it may be, instead of looking inwards and saying, okay, what was my part in this? How did I contribute to this situation? And how can I stop it happening again?
But they also need to be able to deal with the reality of where they're at. And I see some parents who take this very uncompromising view that says, well, if my child doesn't respect me, if my child is not prepared to see me, if my child's not prepared to do this, which is all about how they like to have rules and control their children and what they expect from their kids, guess what? They're not going to have a relationship with their kids, because whilst they're being very uncompromising, and they're thinking about themselves, and they're not really thinking about their kids, and they're angry, and you can normally tell those people a mile away. And we see them a lot on the groups that exist in parental alienation. They're the very angry, uncompromising, targeted parents who they need to get to a place of being calmer before they can actually start their own healing. And they can't help their kids until they're healed. Well, they can help their kids, but they can't help their kids as effectively until they're healed.
Yeah, was it Albert Einstein that said holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die?
Yeah. I think lots of people have been attributed with that quote, but it's exactly that. It's exactly that. Yeah, and it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And in the same way that we drink, well, we end up in this kind of this emotional roller coaster that, as I say, we get put on by the alienator, who then leaves us there, and we end up kind of just self-fulfilling what they want by keeping ourselves in these very negative spaces. And what these angry people don't understand is they're doing the alienator's job for them. It's like, how crazy is that?
Yeah, it's like being on that hamster wheel to nowhere. Keep on going, but nobody's telling you you've got to stay on. You can get off at any moment in time and go and do something different.
Yeah, and that's in part, that's my job, is to help parents to understand the nature of alienation, how it affects their children, how it's affecting them as a parent, how to deal with the alienator, and help them to get off that roller coaster. Because actually it all boils down to, as you will know, how you experience alienation comes down to how we deal with it, how we cope with it. It's our mindset. And if we shift our mindsets, it helps us, it helps our kids, it helps us deal with the alienators so much better.
Yeah.
And that's the real key to it.
So if there's any adults listening to this who may have been on the receiving end of parental alienation as a child, what kind of things might they have remembered from when they were a child?
So adults might have it in their heads. It really depends on their experience of alienation. It's very broad spectrum again, but very often, so my ex is a good example. Her mother, to some degree, alienated her from her dad, and her dad was not an easy person. And I'm just using her as an example rather than saying anything critical about my ex. But she then came into adult life with a deep distrust of men. And then, of course, I pop up. So I'm just this random guy that then she has a deep distrust of. And in fact, she'll have a deep distrust of anybody that she gets into a relationship with. Yeah. And, that's just one example. Other examples where, kids have great sense of abandonment or rejection by parents because they've been told that this person has left them. So they go through into their adult life feeling very unsupported, they might feel unworthy of the relationship. They might feel in part responsible for what's happened with the breakup with their parents, because often kids do. And so you end up with these children who, due to alienation, feel unworthy, they lack confidence, they don't feel they've had enough support. If they've had an alienating parent who's not very good as a parent, then they've been adultified or parentified. And there's a whole slew of stuff that they can bring with them into their own adult experience, which can have an impact on them as well as all the money issues, and the list is long in terms of the way that they might have been affected.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy one to answer, because it's just like pretty much anything you can think of.
Yeah.
It is a way that they can be affected, and some of them become narcissists themselves, because it becomes a go-to reaction.
Yeah.
Because we all subconsciously look to our past experience for lessons of how we deal with the future. And if they see themselves getting into an experience whereby they think, okay, my security is being threatened here, I'm going to go on the attack first, and I'm going to make damn sure that I've already faced abandonment from one parent. I'm not going to let anybody take my kids, so that I have to deal with that with my kids. And then they end up becoming alienators. And it's all, I said, in my view, there's a much smaller number of people who are narcissistic by true character, nature, as opposed to nurtured. I think the vast majority of people who show narcissistic tendencies have been nurtured. And some of them, it's even positively nurtured in the terms of they've been spoiled, they've been given no boundaries, they've been allowed to do what they do, they've been given everything on a plate. That creates narcissists as well, because they just assume that the world owes them a living, the world owes them everything, because that's what they've been privileged to. And they just become impossible people.
Absolutely. So, Charlie, how can anyone listening or watching reach out and speak to you if they feel they may be requiring your services?
Absolutely. Well, very, very quickly, I help in two key ways. Currently, I'm going to be extending the offering out later on this year. But at the moment, I provide something called the 9-step program, which is a structured way through that focuses on the 3 key areas of understanding alienation and your child's perspective, understanding how to deal with the alienators and change your tactics. And then the third one is to help you with your own healing, so that you can take back control of your life and rebuild your own emotional resilience. And the second offering that I have is coaching. So some people just want to dip in and out. And you can go to charliemccready.com. Very nice and simple. But I also provide a lot of free material in the form of posts on Instagram. So you can find me as Charlie McCready on Instagram. You can also find me as Charlie McCready on Facebook, plus another site on Facebook, which is Empowering Parents to Overcome Parental Alienation. And all of those 3 sites on Instagram and Facebook, they've got quite a lot of material that you can read up on, and there's daily insights as to things that will help you through your experience of parental alienation. And if you'd like to work with me, then please reach out to me through my website or through Facebook or Instagram.
Thank you. And I shall put all the links down in the show notes as well. So final question for today, and it's one I don't prime anyone for. As this podcast is called Relationship Revolutions, if there was one thing that would bring a revolution to the world of dating and relationships, what would that one thing be?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. I think the revolution to it, honesty. I want to say honesty. It's there's an awful lot of very old photographs out there, and I think that contributes to a massive sense of disappointment when you actually meet somebody and they've been presenting themselves in a very different way. If you want somebody to like you, be you. Put recent photos up.
Absolutely.
Be really honest with your profile, because there will be people who are attracted to you. Whatever you look like, whoever you are, whatever your experience is, there will be somebody who thinks you're fantastic. So be you, and you'll find that person. If you're somebody else, you're not going to meet the person who's right for you. That would be my penny's worth.
Yeah, and I think that, as you say, using up-to-date photographs is one thing. I see that getting a hell of a lot worse, because I see a lot of photos going to get photoshopped, and the profile's written with AI as well, and by the time you meet the person, it's like, well, you don't communicate the same way. Who are you?
Yeah.
Scary prospect.
Yeah, it's a surprise. I mean, some people try to make themselves, as you say, look better, sound better, maybe sound more intelligent, maybe sound more fun, whatever. And then you meet the person, and then they're not the way they're presenting themselves, and you just feel like you've been conned. And equally, if you're the person who's coming up with this kind of different persona of yourself, then you better deliver on it, because the person that you're meeting will feel conned. And they'll think, well, who are you? You're not
Absolutely.
the person.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like when you tell a lie, you then have to remember what that lie is kind of forever and a day, so that you don't get caught out. Whereas when you tell the truth, your life's easy. And I'm thinking of a great court case where somebody turned up, and one person just turned up with like a blank sheet of paper just to take some notes. And the other party turned up with like huge amounts of files. And you would think that the person who turned up with nothing was very disadvantaged. And it was like, yeah, but I've got the truth. I don't have to remember all these circumstances and lies, so I've got a consistent story. It's in my memory. It's easy. And it's exactly the same thing. You go on a date and you'll find it easy because you're you. It's simple.
Definitely.
But also thank you, Alan, for the opportunity to come along and have the chance to kind of share what I've learned about parental alienation with other parents, because my mission is to help people get through this and avoid making all the mistakes that so many people have made, and also to give them hope and encouragement that there is a lot you can do that will really make your experience much better for you and for your kids. And if you want to rebuild relationships, you need to be actively working on it and doing the right things.
Yeah. And if I remember right, you've also been lobbying Parliament to get this thing recognised, but I think that's going to be a whole separate podcast in itself.
Yeah, I just trying to get the government to. I mean, it's hard. You could argue that you can go down trying to get the government to do it, or you could get the psychologists to recognise it, or you get the judiciary, or some combination of the above. And I think probably the psychologists are one of the best routes, but it requires evidence. And the catch-22 is nobody's spending the money on the evidence, so we haven't got the evidence. And nobody's spending the money on it because they don't believe it's real. But we won't be able to prove it's real until somebody spends the money to create the evidence to go, oh yeah, this is a real thing. It's actually affecting somewhere in the region of 10% of the population of most countries.
And then where do you get the evidence from?
Well, that's it. I mean, if you went and you really went out and you surveyed people, the alienators would of course say they're not alienating, but the people who are experiencing alienation would provide enough comprehensive responses to say, oh yeah, we need to look at this in more detail. That would be your starting point.
Yeah. Here's all these screenshots, and here's when I actually got to see the kids and everything else, and here's the bank statements of the money going out. And
and I think just the research needs to kind of really hinge around the behaviors of the alienators, how it's affecting the children, the trauma the children are going through, how it affects them as adults, how it's affecting the people who are being the targeted parents, and also it has an economic impact on our country because an awful lot of time is spent in courts, which the government pays for, with social services who are inadequately prepared to help us. And so a certain amount of time is wasted with them.
Yeah.
So the people who are suffering from this go through mental illness and then are not available for work, and the government ends up paying for them as well. So it's kind of, and also affects us enormously, which, I mean, the government worries about money. They don't worry about people. So, part of what we need to do is persuade them of the economic impact in order that they spend the money on it.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm very skeptical, but I've been made that way.
And on that bombshell, thank you for joining me. It's been an honor and a pleasure, and we will no doubt speak soon and keep in touch.
Great. Thank you very much, Alan. It's been a pleasure as well.
Thank you for listening to the Relationship Revolutions podcast with Alan Watts, the Love Engineer. If you found this episode useful, please like, subscribe, and share.